You're watching VinylicPumaGaming. So Fallout 4 is a pretty big and expansive game. There are several different plot lines and other aspects of the game that aren't really elaborated on in a whole lot of detail. Some things simply aren't really explained and remain as somewhat of a mystery to Fallout 4's loyal player base. Today, I wanted to discuss some of what I think are Fallout 4's biggest mysteries and largely unanswered questions that concern some of the lore as well as some of the game's plot. Now, before we get into this video, not all of these mysteries are exclusive to Fallout 4 and concern some of the other games in the franchise as well. Mostly, the other games I will be talking about are either Fallout 3 or New Vegas. I may speculate as to where some of the characters from that game are in this game, when perhaps a significant portion of the player base thought that they would be returning. I guess without further ado, these will be the top 10 biggest mysteries and unanswered questions in Fallout 4, so let's go ahead and we'll start with number 10, and that is going to be T60 Power Armor. Other than Fallout 4's loading screens, we don't really know a whole lot about the T60 Power Armor that was introduced in Fallout 4. The T60 Power Armor loading screen says, quote, "The T60 series of power armor saw extensive use by the United States Army after the Battle of Anchorage. In fact, soldiers in T60 power armor were among those trying to retain order on October 23, 2077, the day America fell to atomic war." Now, we also know that the T60 armor was a prototype and that the East Coast Brotherhood of Steel used the armor frequently throughout the game and that they may possibly have the means to make more suits. The thing is, we don't know much more than that. If you consider the lore from all of the previous Fallout games, we know a lot more about T45 and T51 armor, and while there are some things concerning the T60 armor that we can extrapolate based on the pre-established lore from previous games, I'm not really sure how relevant much of that lore is going to be now. Not even considering the Quantum Exo-1 retcon from the Nuka World DLC, power armor in general has been entirely retconned for Fallout 4. Instead of being a suit that you would wear like in previous games, power armor is now more like a vehicle that you enter. The T51 doesn't use TX28 microfusion packs anymore and uses fusion cores instead. While the T51 armor was developed by West Tech, was the T60 armor developed by West Tech, or could have been somebody else? Something that I think would be really useful for the next Fallout game is if Bethesda elaborates on their power armor lore and explains the T60's origins in more depth. Like, who made it, and why was it made when the game's loading screens say that the T51 was the pinnacle of mechanized protection before the Great War. Number 9. Are ghouls immortal? In Fallout 4, you can encounter several ghoul NPCs that were alive before the bombs dropped. There's Edward Winter, who was the crime boss, and you hunt him down as a part of Nick Valentine's mission. There's the kid in the fridge, who hid there as the bombs dropped and lasted for 200 years. And there's also the Vault Tech rep from the very beginning of the game that you can meet when visiting the Vault Tech office in downtown Boston. These are just a few of the pre-war ghouls that you can encounter, and some of these people were at least in their mid-30s, and some may have even been in their late 50s when they first turned into ghouls, and yet they were able to live an additional 200 years after all of those bombs fell. And this would make some of these ghouls as old or older than the sole survivor, which is pretty impressive to think about. Maybe if the ghouls have lived this long, who's to say that they aren't going to live another 200 to 300 years at the very least? In fact, some of them may live long enough to see civilization repair itself and return to how things were before the bombs fell. While you can kill ghouls with bullets or other sharp or blunt objects, they don't seem to really age anymore once they've turned. While they do have the possibility of going feral, and you see this in the Nuka World DLC, their bodies would probably continue to last forever, provided that they had enough access to radiation. Provided the next Fallout game does take place in the future, I'd be curious to know if the Vault Tech representative will be around for that game as well. Number 8. Who, why, and what the heck are the Zeiten Aliens? While this discusses Fallout 3 and even New Vegas somewhat, we still don't really know a whole lot about the mysterious alien race that appears in all three of the games so far. This is kind of funny since Fallout 3 had the Mothership Zeta DLC, where the Lone Wanderer occupies and blows up flying saucers that belong to the Zeiten Aliens. In Fallout 4, once you hit about level 20 or so, you can walk outside and witness some kind of flying object crash in the Commonwealth. If you investigate near Oberlin Station, you can find the downed spacecraft, and in a cave nearby, there is a hostile alien, and if you kill him, you can get the alien blaster pistol. Even after the Mothership Zeta DLC from Fallout 3, we still don't really know where the Zeitans are from, or even why they are observing Earth. They do seem to abduct people, as we've seen in Fallout 3, and they do appear to have been around for a long time, as one of the people that was captured was a samurai from the 1600s. What I think is interesting is that pre-war America seemed to have a relatively accurate idea of what the Zeitans looked like. You can occasionally see comics that depict the Zeitans just like the one you find at the nuclear crash site, and you can also see statue-like turrets in Nuka World that are equipped with some kind of alien handgun as well. It's fairly likely that the Zeitans will remain a mystery until we receive the next Fallout game. Even then, it seems unlikely that Bethesda will reveal where the aliens are from and what their purposes are. And in a certain sense, I guess it adds to the Zeitans' mysteriousness, but I would still like to know who they are and why they exist within the universe. Number 7. How valuable is Pam? If you played through any portion of the Railroad questline, there's a very good chance that you've met Pam. Pam means Predictive Analytical Machine, and it was a robot that was designed to attempt to predict the future. Provided you were able to provide it with all of the necessary data, you could presumably predict the outcomes of specific events. And from a military perspective, this would be extremely useful for many of the factions in the Commonwealth. One of the reasons that the Brotherhood attacks the Railroad is so that they can get Pam. For a military organization, the ability to predict the outcomes of certain battles, log and estimate the amount of time that rations would last, or anything else that's statistics related, could prove to be very useful. I imagine it's very useful for the Railroad as it allows them to predict where escaped synths are going to be and lets them know what to expect when they arrive to help that escaped synth. If the Institute knows about Pam, they might be interested in obtaining her to study her programming in an attempt to reverse engineer it. Or the Minutemen can enlist Sturgis to take a look at Pam as a way to make resource management a little bit easier. To me, it seems like having a machine that has the potential to predict the future would be extremely useful. But I guess we'll never really know just how valuable she is. While she's useful for tracking down stores of supplies and predicting where coursers will appear, that might be all she's good for. Even still, I think most post-apocalyptic factions could use her predictive algorithms, and I wish it was something that was explored more in the game. Number 6. What happened to the original Mechanist from Fallout 3? So assuming you have played Fallout 4's Automatron DLC, you will no doubt have encountered the Mechanist. After defeating a horde of robots, you can confront the Mechanist, and you'll discover that what you thought was a he is actually a she, and her name is Isabel Cruz. She ultimately became the Mechanist as a way to help make the Commonwealth a better place and kill off the raiders with her robots. However, what actually ends up happening is that her robots end up killing indiscriminately, and even some of the people that she intended to protect. For those of you that are familiar with Fallout 3, Isabel Cruz is not the quote-unquote original Mechanist from that game. His name was Scott Walensky, and he donned the persona of the Mechanist in an attempt to protect the town of Canterbury Commons from the Antagonizer. I think many within the player base saw the Automatron trailer from Fallout 4 and believed that the Mechanist from Fallout 3 somehow made his way into the Commonwealth. However, upon actually playing through the DLC, they only discovered that the Mechanist was Isabel Cruz instead. Scott Walensky is 40 during the events of Fallout 3, so he would presumably be in his 50s now. We've seen various other characters from Fallout 3 like Arthur Maxon, Sierra Petrovita from Nuka World, and Joseph McCready and a few others all reappear in Fallout 4, so having the Mechanist from the original game reappear would have been possible. Scott is also not quite as much of a Samaritan as Isabel is, and while he did attempt to protect the town, just like the antagonizer, he drops a finger upon his death if the player is working with the regulators, and this indicates that he is an evil character. I think having the original Mechanist would have been a little darker than what we ultimately got with Isabel Cruz. Either way, I'd be somewhat curious to know what happened to the original Mechanist we all know from Fallout 3. Maybe he is still in the Capital Wasteland, or maybe he's somewhere else in post-war America. Number 5. Where did the Gunners come from, and who employs arms and trains them? There's a good chance that if you played through Fallout 4 for any significant period of time, that you've come across a military organization known as the Gunners. The Gunners always appeared to be wearing a combination of green army fatigues, as well as combat armor when you encounter them. We actually know a fair amount about the Gunners in the sense that they seem to take inspiration from the US military, and that they also seem to follow a strict chain of command and even use some of the same military ranking system that the US military did before the war. Gunners also often come well equipped with some of Fallout 4's higher-end weapons like laser weapons, plasma weapons, and some occasionally carry rippers into combat. Ultimately, the Gunners are very effective and brutal mercenaries for hire, and when you ask Deacon about them, he says that no one knows who is pulling the Gunners' strings. Considering the other factions in the Wasteland, it's unclear where an advanced military force like this would come from and who would have the capacity and the resources to employ, arm, and train them. While the Brotherhood are highly trained soldiers, they have ties to the pre-war American military. The Gunners, on the other hand, don't. Ultimately, it's sort of weird that the Gunners weren't explored more in Fallout 4 since they do serve as a sort of a nemesis for the Commonwealth Minutemen. While the Minutemen typically use their military might to help others, the Gunners use their military might for their own profit. In a certain way, I guess the Gunners are sort of like modern PMCs or private military companies. PMCs are typically groups of trained former military men and women that are hired either for security purposes or to take part in direct armed combat. Though I would like to think real-world PMCs aren't as cruel as the Gunners are. Regardless, while we know some things about the Gunners, there's also a lot that we really don't know about the Gunners. Perhaps they are backed by a mysterious third party, but we have no idea who that would be. Number 4. Is Elder Maxon using cybernetics? When you go to the Prydwen and check out Proctor Quinlan's terminal, you can read a section called The Rise of Elder Maxon. This is ultimately backstory for what happened to the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 3 as it transitioned into the Brotherhood of Steel that we all know from Fallout 4. More importantly, it serves as Elder Maxon's origin story. However, in the very last section called Aftermath, Quinlan has something very interesting to say about Elder Maxon. The passage reads, and I quote, "Arthur Maxon is happy to be one thing, the perfect human specimen, an example of everything a human being can achieve, assisted, even enhanced by advanced technology, but still very much human." A theory I have is perhaps Maxon was greatly injured during his fight with the Deathclaw at the age of 13. Maybe Brotherhood soldiers discovered some kind of cybernetics tech and used it to heal and make Arthur Maxon stronger than he was previously. You've also got to admit that it's pretty strange that the only time Elder Maxon wears power armor is when the sole survivor and the Institute attack the Prydwen. During the assault on the Institute, however, Maxon charges into battle with just his regular clothes. Ultimately, the Brotherhood seemed pretty comfortable with cybernetics, as Star Paladin Cross from Fallout 3 was a cyborg. Perhaps her cybernetics were adapted to Maxon when he was injured fighting the Deathclaw. Or maybe this could just be some of Proctor Quinlan's propaganda and may be meaningless in the long run. But it does make you wonder a little bit. Number 3. What happens to Nick Valentine after he has Kellogg's memories? At the very end of Fallout 4's Dangerous Minds quest, you can approach Nick Valentine and it will appear that Kellogg has somehow taken over. This is actually a really cool surprise the very first time that it happens. However, once Nick regains control, it never happens again. You can play through the rest of the game with Nick Valentine as your companion, and even do some of his companion affinity quests, and unfortunately, Kellogg's memories will never reappear. Even in Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, where Nick Valentine is one of the primary companions for the DLC, Kellogg doesn't ever take over. We don't see anything like this in the Nuka World DLC either. I'm actually somewhat surprised that Bethesda didn't reintroduce Kellogg in Nick Valentine's body at some point further on into the main story. Having Kellogg's memories would have some effect on Nick Valentine, and it appears that Kellogg's memories seem to be able to temporarily gain control from time to time. If Kellogg's memories have already done this once, what's preventing them from taking over Nick Valentine entirely? There's also the idea that if you were able to acquire someone's memories, you in a certain sense would become them. Nick Valentine possesses the memories of the pre-war detective Nick Valentine, and when the Institute implants the memories of a captured individual into a synth, the synth believes that they are in fact the person whose memories they possess. Case in point, Paladin Danse believed he was the real Danse and not a synth replacement, which is something you find out during the Blind Betrayal quest. Regardless, this could have been a really interesting facet that Bethesda could have explored. Whether there wasn't enough time for it or it just had to get cut, I think it's a shame that Kellogg's memories didn't take over any more than they did. Number 2. What is the Soul Survivor's backstory? While I suppose someone could make the argument that since Fallout 4 is a role-playing game, that you, the player, are supposed to determine your character's backstory. If this were Skyrim, Fallout 3, or New Vegas, this argument would make a lot more sense in my opinion. However, because we already know that Nate and Nora have a backstory, and both characters are fully voiced protagonists, similar to Commander Shepard from the Mass Effect series, I'm still pretty curious about what Nate and Nora were like before the day the bombs fell on October 23, 2077. All we know is that Nate is an Army veteran who served in the U.S. Army's 108th Infantry Regiment, and that he was presumably supposed to make a speech that night at the Veterans Hall. This is indicated by something Nora says as soon as you finally select your character's appearance, as well as a terminal entry that's located at Fraternal Post 115. As for Nora, all we really know about her is that she was a lawyer before she entered Vault 111. When you compare this to Commander Shepard from Mass Effect, Shepard has some pre-service history as well as a psychological profile that can be determined by the player. It isn't really in depth, but it's something more significant than just being in the army or being a lawyer. Honestly, I think Bethesda could have done something really interesting with the Soul Survivor's backstory. If they chose to copy Mass Effect, it would be interesting to have Nate recount some kind of brutal battle where he let his entire unit die if you chose to make him a more ruthless character during the character creation. Or maybe Nora uncovered some corporate corruption that saves the lives of many people before the Great War. I'm surprised we didn't learn more about the Soul Survivor's background through any sort of DLC or any other expansion content. It would have been nice to learn more about what the player character is really like. Number 1. Why did Father make the child synth Sean? Ultimately, it's a mystery why Father would go to the trouble of creating the child synth version of himself. While we do know that Father released the Soul Survivor from the vault, it seems like Father would want to let the Soul Survivor into the Institute as soon as possible so that the people of the Commonwealth couldn't corrupt them into thinking that the Institute was bad. Think about it. What's the purpose of having one of your biological parents struggle to get into the Institute? Especially when you consider that the Commonwealth is full of numerous deadly threats. If Father was aware, what was the point of making the Soul Survivor think that the 10-year-old child synth was their son instead of him? If it's a matter of just killing Kellogg, wouldn't it be better to get the Soul Survivor to go to the Institute, equip them with some nice guns and Exo Power Armor, and then kill Kellogg? Even if the Soul Survivor didn't believe Father initially, he has ways of proving he is in fact who he says he is. So ultimately, what's the point of Father commissioning Dr. Lee to develop the child synth, Sean? The only thing that I think I can come up with is that maybe Father figured that the Soul Survivor couldn't believe that their son was biologically older than them. If you had a child, you were suddenly cryogenically frozen, and you emerged 60 years later only to find that the old man you're talking to was your son, that would be pretty weird. But still, Father has feasible ways of proving who he says he is in a way that the Soul Survivor would understand. After all, DNA checking existed before the Great War. It could also be that the child synth Sean is more advanced than your typical synth in the sense that he might be able to age where the other synths cannot. But that is speculation. I don't think we'll ever really know why Father made the child synth version of himself. Maybe it was part of some elaborate plot, but why would Father risk his own biological parent in the process? Especially when he seems to be really keen to meet the sole survivor. Alright guys, that's going to pretty much wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, please be sure to leave a like and let me know, what is your biggest mystery or biggest unanswered question that Fallout 4 presents? Leave that in the description, but otherwise, like this video if you liked it, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.